My name's Darren Northcott. I'm the National Official for Education for the NASUWT. Thanks for joining us this morning. I'm going to share my screen, which I must admit I'm not particularly good at. Give me an opportunity to see if we can do this. Don't always get it right. Hopefully you can see that. Hopefully you can see that presentation. Good. Let me start the slideshow. Great. Okay. So yes, what we want to do this morning is just talk about a few things that might be of interest to you as newly qualified teachers at this stage of your career, as it were. So what I'm going to do is just talk about some issues you might want to think about in respect of completing or continuing, depending upon your circumstances, your induction. And I'm also going to talk about what you may have picked up around a plan that's been taken forward now by the DfE to provide some funding for schools for some additional non-teaching time for what in DfE speak is called NQT +1 teachers. So effectively that's teachers who were undertaking their induction during 2020-2021. Many of you, I think, might have heard Francis and Gareth from the DfE talk about some of these issues this morning. I just want to go through them, if you like, from an NASUWT perspective, just so you're clear about what our advice and what our information is. And it may give you an opportunity to ask some questions that you've thought about since the presentation earlier this morning that you'd like to ask. And then I'm going to talk also about 5 things to look out for in 21-22. So for us as a trade union representing your interests, what are the 5 really big issues that everyone in the education system is going to be grappling with over the course of the next academic year? And what I suggest we do is I'll just talk a little bit about these issues. And if any questions or observations occur to you while I'm talking, if you just put those in the Q&A, what I'll do at the end is I'll look through the Q&A and I'll pick out your question or your observation and I'll try and address that. Okay. Just also to make the point that absolutely feel free to share any observations from your own experience and that you've been dealing with in your school. If there's a particular personal issue that you're dealing with that you're really concerned about, by all means, you can kind of relate that, if you like, in your question. But I think the advice would always need to be, you probably need to have a conversation with us. I know you've had the contact details for our advice team shared with you, but we are here to provide you with confidential, tailored personal advice for your circumstances. So that's the key reason why we're here for you. So don't forget, if you have concerns about any aspect of your employment, any aspect of your induction, we're here for you, and there are ways in which you can access that advice. But we'll maybe touch on that a little bit later on as well. So let's just start by looking at completion of induction. And I think a lot of you, but certainly by no means all of you, will be at the stage now where you are about to complete your induction. And in the statutory guidance that governs induction, there are different ways in which you can reach that point where induction is completed. For most people, it's that you've reached, if you like, the end of 3 terms on a full-time equivalent basis of a standard school year. So we always talk about induction under the current arrangements lasting for a year, 3 terms, for those working full-time. It's often prorated if you're working part-time. You just come to the end of the prescribed length of that induction. And some of you, we also have agreed a reduced period for your induction. That's often if you've had significant prior experience of working with children and young people, you've got QTS, but you've also got a lot of experience behind you as well in working in educational settings. There's provision in the current guidance to end your induction earlier than the 3-term full-time equivalent limit that's set out in normal circumstances. As long as that's agreed, then that's perfectly acceptable in the context of the statutory guidance and the regulations that govern induction. You might have had your period of induction extended because you might be absent during the course of induction, or maybe it was agreed that extending that induction would be helpful for you. But whatever, if you're coming to the end of your induction, there's a few things you might just want to take particular note of. Just be clear about how decision that you've completed induction successfully is reached. The decision isn't actually made by your head teacher or principal. What your head teacher or principal does is give a recommendation to the appropriate body. And as I'm sure you're all aware, the appropriate body is an organisation that oversees schools that are employing NQTs to make sure that those schools are giving NQTs full access to their statutory entitlements and are conducting induction in an appropriate way. So the appropriate body, that is the organisation responsible for deciding whether or not you have completed induction, but they act on a recommendation made by the head teacher. In almost all circumstances, the appropriate body will accept the head teacher's recommendation. And then once that's agreed, that is then recorded by the Teaching Regulation Agency, and they keep a record of all those who have completed induction. So essentially, your records will indicate that you have completed induction successfully. So at the end of the process, in almost all circumstances, the recommendation is that the NQT passed their induction, the appropriate body accepts that, that's logged with the TRA. And there are three possible outcomes, successful in almost all circumstances. Sometimes it's deemed that induction has not been completed successfully, but if there are any problems, what almost always happens is an agreed extension to the induction period. And there is a right of appeal to the Teaching Regulation Agency. That effectively is the government. It's the Secretary of State. It's Gavin Williamson. He makes that decision technically, but it's done through the TRA. If there are any concerns about the way in which the decision has been reached or the recommendation that was made, then go to the Teaching Regulation Agency to put right whatever it might have been that's gone wrong. So it's the TRA that ultimately, the Secretary of State ultimately, who decides whether someone has completed induction or not. The appropriate body makes that decision in practice, and then it comes ultimately, I think, down to, or almost always, the recommendation of the head teacher. It's really important, and we say this throughout induction, but if you've got any concerns that you're not going to complete induction successfully, you really must seek immediate advice and support from the NHWT. So if you're sitting here this morning worried that you may not have completed your induction successfully, or there might be a problem, or that your head teacher may not recommend that you've completed induction successfully, you're concerned that your head teacher might suggest that you need an extension to the induction period, or that you haven't completed induction successfully and that should be the decision. It's really, really important you seek advice and guidance from us. Don't sit there worrying without support. We are here to provide you with that support. So if you're concerned, please do come and speak to us. Another point I'm going to make, which seems obvious, and I'm sure all of you will recognize this, but I will make the point because it does come up from time to time. There'll be documentation that you'll receive in respect of your induction, but particularly the confirmation of your successful completion of induction. You will get a document that confirms that. It's really important you retain it. Really important you retain a copy. So all those really important documents that we have in our lives, things like our birth certificates, our A-level certificates, our degree certificates, all of those really key life documents that you have, it's really important you retain confirmation that you've completed induction. The reason I raise that is we do have, it's rare, it is rare to underline that, but it does happen. We do have cases that arise sometime after a teacher believes they've completed induction successfully, where for some reason, because one of the reasons I often comes up is because I talk about the TRA keeping the record. Over the years, the body that's kept that record has changed quite a lot. So it's changed at least 4 times over the past 10 years. It's been a new part of government that's kept that documentation. Go back 10 years, it was something called the General Teaching Council that kept that documentation. Mistakes can happen. and there can be administrative errors. And we have dealt with members who are absolutely clear that they've completed induction, but no one can find any record of it. The best thing in those cases where it isn't possible to check with the appropriate body or with the TRA that someone has completed induction is if that teacher can just present the documentation they received at the time. That tends to end any ambiguity about your status. It's really helpful. So we make that point, please keep all the documentation that relates to induction. Keep it safe, because you never know, you might need to produce it at some point to prove your status as a teacher who has completed induction successfully. So I think that's a point that I want to emphasize, but I'm sure it's something you would all be doing anyway. You might be in a position, moving on then, if you've not come to a point yet where you're ready to complete induction, so your induction is going to continue into the next academic year, and that can be, as I say, for various reasons. It can be because you've agreed an extension, or because you've not yet completed 1 year of induction. You might have been working part-time, you might have been working on a supply basis, you've not quite reached that 1 year milestone yet, and curtailing induction early isn't an option in your case, or it doesn't seem appropriate, or you're not ready, quite understandably, to give away all the rights and entitlements you have as an NQT, like 10% reduction timetable, teaching time. So you might be in a position where in the next academic year, you're going to be continuing with your induction. And as I think was mentioned in the earlier session, things are changing as far as induction is concerned for principally those completing their initial teacher training this year and who are going to be new teachers in the next academic year, because they will be completing their induction under a new system, Early Career Framework, the ECF. We've just put some advice and guidance on our website about the ECF, so if you want to find out more about it, then that's the place to look. Just type Early Career Framework into the search engine, it will come up. But the key thing, I think, if you're continuing your induction into the next academic year, to keep in mind is that there's a transitional period. So one of the key changes with the ECF is that there is a 2-year typical induction period. So the typical induction period increases from 1 year to 2 years for new teachers next year. Also note, from next year, new teachers, so those completing their ITT this year, and then they're going to be new teachers next year, they will be referred to as ECTs, not NQTs. So you are the last ever cohort of NQTs in the education system in England. From then on, they're going to be called ECTs. There could be some confusion about that, but just be aware that the people you'll be working with next year who've just completed their initial teacher training, they will be referred to as ECTs, not NQTs. And one of the reasons for that is to mark the fact that we've got this new system. But if you started your induction, if you started it, but you've not yet completed it, you will, until September 2023, be under the old requirements. There's a transitional period. So you will still be required to complete the equivalent of 1 year of induction, not 2 years of induction. If, however, you've started your induction before September 2021 and you've still not completed it by 2023, then the ECF is going to apply and your induction period will increase from 1 year to 2 years. You can offset what you've done so far against the 2 years, but just bear in mind, if you think or it transpires that you're still not going to be in a position to complete your induction by 2023, then your statutory induction period will increase from 1 year to 2 years. If you're going to complete your induction before September 2023, then you're still subjected to the 1 year induction, not the 2 year induction. I hope that's reasonably clear. Maybe the other point to bear in mind if you're still continuing your induction is that it should pretty much continue as it has before, but one of the changes with the ECF is a kind of program, if you like, a curriculum of early formation for teachers. One of the criticisms that you may well have and that others that have gone before you have had, is that the quality of induction is too variable sometimes. So some schools, some employers provide a really good induction experience, but for others, it hasn't really met the expectations of certainly the NQTs themselves. That's been a consistent message we've received, to be honest with you, over the past 20 years from newly qualified teachers. It's certainly a message that the government surveys of newly qualified teachers have highlighted as well. So the early career framework is designed to provide a more consistent experience and more consistent professional development than perhaps has been the case previously. There are lots of issues with the early career framework. I mean, to summarize, really good in theory, potentially, but the way in which it's being implemented is quite challenging, to put it mildly. But from your point of view, just bear in mind that you have the option, if you're continuing your induction, to make use of some of the materials that have been produced for the early career framework, and you might find those quite helpful. But in sort of simple terms, you will continue under the old arrangements, not the new arrangements. That will be the case until September 2023. So, any questions on that, please do ask them. The next thing I want to kind of come on to, which again I think was touched on with Francis and Gareth earlier this morning, but I'll try and go into it into a little more detail, is as part of the government's announcements around what it's describing currently as education recovery. We'll come on to education recovery a little bit later on. One of the initiatives they announced was to provide additional funding for those currently undertaking induction in the next year. So this kind of DFE term, which I don't like particularly, NQT +1. So if you're doing induction this year, what would normally happen is if you were completing your induction this year, or you've done your induction this year, but let's use the example of someone who completed their induction. This is one of the problems with the current system, is that once you've completed your induction, that's that. So all the support and the guidance and the advice that you're supposed to get as a newly qualified teacher, it all comes to an end once you've completed your induction. So you lose, normally, you would lose the 10% reduction in timetable teaching time. That no longer applies to you. And that's something that I think a lot of us find quite problematic. What the government has done for 1 year only is said to schools, if you're employing someone who is undertaking induction in 2020-21, so i.e. the current academic year, we will give you funding to provide the equivalent of 5% of timetable per NQT. So you can calculate, there's a calculation as to how much it would cost to release someone in your position if you completed induction, so in their second year of teaching, to release that person for 5%. So in effect, instead of having nothing, so you've got 10% when you're a reduction in timetable teaching time when you're doing your induction, which normally moves to nothing in your second year, they are giving schools the money to provide a 5% reduction, the equivalent of a 5% reduction in timetable teaching time in your second year. And that money is going to be given automatically to schools. So the DFE can calculate, there's a formula they can use. They know where NQTs are working, they know which schools they're working in, and those schools will get additional funding that should allow for that reduction, that 5% reduction in timetable teaching time in the second year. One issue, and it's a fair point that's been raised about that, is while that's welcome, because that doesn't normally happen in your second year, there's no recognition of the fact you're still a relatively new teacher. You get PPA time, which you should get anyway. You don't get anything on top of that. So 5% is welcome, but it was announced very late in the day. And I think one of the characteristic features of what's happened during the pandemic is that a lot of things that might in other circumstances be pretty much universally welcomed, because they're announced pretty late on, it then does create genuine challenges for schools in organising it. So if we're saying a 5% reduction in timetable time, that's difficult, particularly, not exclusively, but particularly in secondary schools which have already, in most cases, worked through their timetable for the next academic year, and then they're told you have to provide 5% non-contact time in your timetable, given the fact, however, that you've already produced your timetable. I've heard from some schools say, well, we've done that, but it's not going to be a problem. Having that 5% reduction in timetable teaching time, we think we can timetable it. We don't have a problem with that. Some schools have said that would be really difficult. So what the DfE has done is it said it can be used flexibly. So it doesn't have to be a fixed 5% reduction every week or a fixed 10% reduction every 2 weeks. It can be used flexibly. So it can be used to provide, for example, days away from the classroom less frequently than that. The key point is that over the course of the year, it has to add up to a 5% reduction in timetable teaching time. That money is going into schools' accounts, and then there's going to be an issue about how that money is going to be used. Schools will be held to account for how that money is used. So one of our concerns was that if you give schools the money, you just give them this additional money for NQT release time, how will you know that the money is being used for the purposes for which it was intended? So the DfE have said that they will hold schools to account. They will be checking. The precise form of that check has still not been determined, but they will check that the money is used. And if the school says, which it will have the ability to do, the school says we don't, because they're not being compelled to provide this 5% reduction. If a school says we're not providing the 5% reduction, then what the school is supposed to do is return the money to the DfE. So if the money is retained, it must be used for this purpose. If it's not used for that purpose, the money must be returned. What mustn't happen is that money that's given to schools to help you is used for something else. And I have to say, in our system, that is a big risk. That happens more than we would like. So a key point here, key distinction, if you like, between this 5% and the 10% is that the 10% was statutory, which means it's a legal obligation on the school to provide it, or setting wherever you're doing your reduction. In this arrangement, the facility, the school has the ability to provide 5%. It's been given money to do that. If it takes the money, then it must provide the 5%. But the school can say, we don't want to provide 5%, have your money back. So we'll be producing some advice and guidance for certainly members in those circumstances, but also those who represent members, so that we can be very clear that schools shouldn't be handing the money back. They should be keeping the money, and they should then make sure that you are getting an additional period of time over the course of the year away from the classroom, so you can focus on your professional development. That is a recognition. I think we wanted more than 5%, and we wanted it to be statutory, but that is a recognition of the fact that you have had a very disrupted induction experience, and the 5% is there to support you in what have been really challenging circumstances within which to be an NQT. So from our point of view, schools have that money, they should use that money appropriately. And bear in mind, they don't have to give you if they're finding it difficult, they don't have to give you a fixed block of 5% every week or a fixed block of 10% every week. It can be done flexibly, but it's going to be really important if you're in that position, if you are an NQT +1, to use that rather clunky term, if you are an NQT +1 next year, then we would want to know from you whether your school is using the money it's been given in the right way. So there should be a conversation early on, either in the autumn term or preferably before the end of this term, where the school decides how it's going to use that money that's available to provide that reduction. You should have a say in that, so you should be consulted over that. You should be able to articulate your views about the way in which you think that money might best be spent. But if they keep the money, they've got to use it for that purpose. So that, I think, is going to be a really important point in the next academic year. Okay. What I want to end by is just thinking about the education system that we'll be working within in the next academic year, and what are some of the big issues for us as a trade union representing your interests. So what our members telling us are the big issues, the big matters of concern for teachers, school leaders, learners, and their families going into the next academic year. I've kind of settled on 5 here. I think I could probably justify these 5 as being those issues that perhaps members are most interested in, most concerned about in the next academic year. But frankly, if you were to say to me, what about issue X, issue Y, issue Z that isn't on that list, there are lots of issues. You'd probably have a point. There are lots of issues of concern, given the fact that we've got an education system that has just suffered a once-in-a-century shock, the pandemic. We've had an education system that in many respects has proved itself to be very fragile in the face of that shock. And the way in which we organise education, certainly in England, particularly I may be looking at qualifications there as a particular issue, it's been a profound shock to the system. And the only thing we would say that's kept the show on the road has been the commitment, the determination, the professionalism of you and every other teacher working in that system. The whole thing has depended upon the teaching workforce and the wider school workforce to maintain educational provision in exceptional circumstances. So it's been incredibly challenging, and it's going to continue to be challenging in 21. We don't know what's going to happen with the pandemic. We don't know what the state of play will be come September and the rest of the academic year. But the legacy effects of the disruption, even if we are in a place in the autumn term where things can return to the pre-pandemic normality in that sense, there are still ongoing issues, ongoing implications of what's happened over the past 15 to 16 months that will need to be dealt with. So just to kind of summarize some of these issues that you might want to be aware of in terms of where the union is coming from. And I think the big issue, certainly the big issue for our members, I think this I could quite safely say is the #1 issue that members raise as a concern or an area of interest, is what's generally called education recovery. And this is the sense in which the learning of children and young people, but also their social development, their emotional development, well-being, their mental health, has been impacted really profoundly by the pandemic. And as people working in schools, you know that better than anyone. You know the impact that this has had, not just on learning, but on all aspects of children and young people's lives. And there are those out there, and they're a minority, but sometimes they're influential, who have the view that basically the system can fix itself. So the issues around learning loss, to use that term, the other implications of the pandemic, those will fix themselves. Children are resilient, they're robust. All you need to do, you don't really need to do anything specific in respect of education recovery. All you have to do is send children and young people back to school, get teachers and the school workforce back in schools, carry on as normal, so carry on as things were pre-March 2020, and effectively it will heal itself. So there's that kind of view that you hear. And I don't think we would share that view, and I don't think anyone who works in a school would share that view. Yes, children can be resilient. Yes, children can recover quickly, but I don't think that's by any manner of means a universal experience. I think the evidence is really clear. The impact on children and young people has been really deep and really profound. So we need additional interventions to address the impact of the pandemic. There needs to be a strategic plan, and you will know that has been the subject of some controversy. The government's Education Recovery Commissioner, Kevin Collins, resigned because he felt that the commitments the government were making were insufficient and weren't addressing the key issues. The government continues to say that what it's announced so far is just the start. There'll be more coming down the track in terms of investment, in terms of a plan for education recovery. There will be a comprehensive spending review where the government sets its financial priorities in the medium term. That will be coming up. And we are told by the Department of Education, by the government, that education recovery will be a big part of that. So that is a very clear message from our members, that there needs to be more investment, more support to allow for education recovery to take place. And there have been some initiatives. So we talked earlier about the 5% reduction in timetable teaching time for NQT +1 teachers. A lot of the focus so far, a lot of the investment that's been put into the system so far has been around tutoring. And there's evidence that tutoring is an effective intervention, but it certainly isn't a panacea. It isn't a silver bullet that can solve all problems. And there are issues around tutoring. There are issues in terms of how that's organised. There are issues, certainly we had a meeting yesterday of primary members, and we were talking about tutoring, and some of the primary members we were speaking to were very clear that they felt tutoring could be quite problematic, because often the tutoring model involves withdrawing children from classrooms to be taught separately, either individually or in very small groups, where the teachers we were talking to were very clear that the best place actually for those children would be in the classroom, and then having more in-class support. So there are issues there around that tutoring model that need to be addressed, but there's evidence that tutoring can be effective if deployed effectively. There are certainly issues. I don't know if any of you have been involved in undertaking tutoring work. There are certainly issues about the variability of the employment conditions that tutors have, the variability of the support that they have. The oversight of the tutoring program has been given to an organisation called Randstad, which is a supply agency and employment agency. There are questions there about whether that was the right decision or not. We shall see. A lot of concern from members about that. But it can't just be about tutoring. Pretty much every penny that's been announced so far, it's an insufficient sum, has been focused on tutoring. And there are lots of issues our members raise in relation to education recovery. One of them, again, we were talking to primary members about this yesterday, but there are certainly issues in the secondary curriculum about breadth and balance in the curriculum. One of the concerns that I think we hear from both primary and secondary colleagues is that there's a kind of hierarchy of subjects, and some subjects and some areas of learning are really being seen as second class or having inferior status to core subjects. Breadth and balance is a really important part of education recovery. Again, there are those, think about the primary sector, there are those who would say, well, pretty much all you need to focus on, you need more of a focus on literacy, numeracy, English and maths, core subjects. Those are foundational. We've never argued with that, absolutely. But you do need breadth and balance. Very clear message from parents as well, and certainly from young people. So having a curriculum that has breadth and balance is a really important point. Another issue around education recovery that we've pushed very hard is the fact that you're probably going to need a bigger workforce to deliver education recovery. So sure, there are tutors, but I think we're going to need more teachers, more education support staff working in schools. I think this will require a bigger workforce. If you look at countries like the United States, look at the Netherlands, which have very well advanced education recovery strategies, the heart of it is investing in the workforce and investing also to increase the size of that workforce, and the reasons why that's important, I think I don't need to explain. The challenge we have, of course, in the education system in England is that for the past 10 years, we've had a profound recruitment and retention crisis. So for the majority of the past 10 years, the government has missed its recruitment target for new teachers, and the number of teachers departing teaching is increasing and has increased significantly. That's not, interestingly, just because of retirement, people reaching retirement age. Actually, we have a very strange demographic, very unusual demographic in England compared to other countries where they have a disproportionate number of teachers who are at or approaching retirement age. That isn't an issue particularly in England. It's a more younger, the kind of mean age of teachers is much younger in England than it is elsewhere. These are teachers leaving after 3, 4, 5 years, but also 10 years, 15 years. These are people leaving, taking really significantly reduced, really impacting on their pensions because they want to be teaching. It's a profound crisis that needs to be addressed, and we'll make that to the government. That the first step, making sure there's a workforce that can support education recovery, is investing in that workforce and tackling that crisis. Wider children's services, really, really key. There's I think a very unhelpful narrative that all the impact of the pandemic and all its impacts on children and people effectively can be solved in school. I think what we've seen during the pandemic is that it's not just schools, it's wider children's services. So it's things like CAMS, it's things like social care services. All of those have a part to play in supporting children holistically, looking at children as children, not just in one context as a learner, in another context as another context as a person with health needs, investing in those services. And I think what we've seen over the pandemic is that a decade of austerity and underinvestment in those wider children's services has really had a serious impact. So investing in those children's services is really important. And then the educational and social disparities. We know that the pandemic has hit everyone in the system very hard, children, young people, certainly the workforce as well, but it's hit some groups of children and young people harder than others. And that I think is very clear in respect of the kind of racial disparities that we see, also the geographical disparities, the disparities between more advantaged children and less advantaged children. These are really key points. And if the government is serious about increasing the opportunities available to historically underrepresented and marginalized groups, then recognizing in the first instance and addressing those disparities is really key. Another big issue that again, I think has dominated people's thinking over the course of the last 2 years has been qualifications. And we've had 2 years of disruption. Those of you working in the secondary sector, teaching general qualifications or vocational and technical qualifications will know how incredibly difficult this has been. There's a story to be told about why certain decisions were made in respect of qualifications. We were very clear, and I think we were pretty much alone in this, is we did not think that the solution reached this year was the right solution. There were better ways of doing it. But unfortunately, the government went this way, and it's been incredibly difficult. There are some who say, well, once we're over this year, then there isn't going to be a problem in 2022. That's not right, because obviously you've got cohorts, year 11, year 13, who've had 2 years of disruption to their learning. So you can't just reimpose the 2019 arrangement, put all the exams back in place, unmitigated, and say we're back to normal now. Let's turn the clock back to 2019. That isn't going to work. The government accept that that isn't going to work, that there will continue to be a need for mitigations in 21, 22. There's going to be a consultation on what those mitigations should be. That's due very, very soon. We just completed a survey of our members around what the mitigations, what the better mitigations might be for the next academic year. And there are a number that you could select from. There was a very, very clear message from our members that doing what we've done this year again next year would not be acceptable. And I think that message has been at least acknowledged by the government. There are a range of things we can do to try and make the examination system next year manageable, but also address the learning impacts of the pandemic. And we'll be doing some more work on that in the weeks and months to come. Just to be also clear, however, and I think it's part of the reality, is that there are no perfect solutions. So every solution that we can identify, or that anyone can identify, to addressing the impact of the pandemic on qualifications is not problem-free. And often you're trading off solving one problem against another problem. Try and solve one problem, you create a different problem. So across the UK, there are 4 different qualification systems. They've all faced problems, but they've all faced different problems to some extent, because they prioritise some things over others. For us, the priority, one of the key priorities, is manageability. It's recognising the fact that the workforce through a period of exceptional pressure over the past 2 years, and that the solution cannot be one that tries to eke more out of a workforce that's been under huge pressure. And then we need to look at long-term reforms. Clearly, our education, our qualification system, our examination system is not resilient, and there is an opportunity perhaps to look at how we credit learning at the end of Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5. Does the system that we have currently meet our expectations, meet the expectations of learners? Is it sufficiently flexible? Does it take into account the demands that managing the qualification system has for the workforce? And just very briefly, accountability, huge issue. You will all pretty much, I might be wrong in one or two cases, but pretty much your professional teaching career has taken place in a context where there's not really been the kind of extensive accountability regime that was in place before the pandemic. So performance tables have been suspended. In the primary sector, SATs have been suspended. Progress 8 is the main accountability measure. In the secondary sector, that has been suspended. And the government is keen to reintroduce those accountability measures. And from our point of view, those accountability measures are flawed for lots of reasons, which I'm sure you're familiar with. But the government is keen to reintroduce them. So it plans to reintroduce some sort of performance indicator for primary and secondary schools next year. It plans to reintroduce SATs and other statutory assessments in 21-22. We're very clear that whatever you think about performance tables and whatever you think about SATs, next year is not the time to reintroduce them. So we will continue to press for the continued suspension of performance tables, the continued suspension of statutory assessments, because they're not going to help the system focus on its priority, which is education recovery. But again, we've got an opportunity to reassess those accountability structures. Do we have to put back what was in place before, or is there a better way of holding schools to account? Those accountability measures had a profoundly distorting and negative impact on what went on in schools, and we have an opportunity to try and address those to some extent. Very weak pay. We could spend a whole day exploring the matter of pay. It's that complex, but it really is a key concern for our members. There's a public sector pay freeze which excludes the health service, but the government is clear it wants to see a public sector pay freeze. The consultation on pay arrangements for next year is due soon. This is very late in the day, so we still don't know what pay will look like from next September. The consultation will take place over the summer. That's entirely unacceptable. But in our evidence too, in broad terms, pay in England is determined by something called the School Teachers Review Body. It's an independent body. Its findings don't apply in academies and free schools. Formally, it does influence them. We've made very clear that the impact of 10 years of pay freezes, pay restraint, has meant that pay in teaching is extremely unattractive compared to other professions. That has to be addressed. We would say that has to be addressed as part of an education recovery strategy. You're not going to retain the teachers, not to keep you, other teachers in the profession who don't have better rates of pay. Pay is really important. Absolutely clear message from our members, reinforced time after time after time. And one of the other issues, again, that we encounter are barriers to pay progression. There's a session on performance management this afternoon where we might explore that in a bit more detail. It's not just about the overall pay rates, it's how quickly and how fairly you progress up pay ranges. That is really key. And pay inequality is a massive issue. There are still significant disparities in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of disability, in terms of LGBT status for teachers. The evidence is really clear about that. Pay systems in schools are in many really profound ways discriminatory. That has to be addressed. That is a core union. Then the final issue I'm going to touch on is, again, I think some might argue the most important issue, which is workload and well-being. Going into the pandemic, we surveyed our members every year, really clear that workload was the #1 concern teachers had prior to the pandemic by the proverbial country mile. To some extent, other concerns have kind of come up to sit alongside workload, but workload is still a massive issue and has been a massive issue during the pandemic. Put crudely, we went into the pandemic with excessive and unnecessary workload burdens being a characteristic feature of the system. To some extent, those have just continued as they were. So we've continued seeing the causes of pre-pandemic workload continue into the pandemic. And then you've had everything else on top. So what schools haven't done is cleared the decks, created the space to concentrate on dealing with the pandemic, just retained poor workload intensive practice and other things such as qualifications, such as remote and blended learning, just been on top of that. That really has created a workload crisis. There's a lot the DfE can do. There's an awful lot the DfE can do to address workload concerns, no question about that. But also there's a lot that employers can do. While we see that workload is an issue across the system, we also see that it can vary quite significantly from school to school, employer to employer. To a large extent, the workload that teachers face, the extent of unnecessary and excessive workload burdens, is something that schools can address to a large extent. Some do a really good job, some do a less good job. And I think for us, it's also not only about challenging the DfE, it's about challenging schools, challenging employers to do the right things. Just worth noting that the three big drivers of workload going into the pandemic, again, by some considerable distance, we asked teachers before the pandemic, what really drives excessive workload? It's the big three, which are marking, planning, and assessment. And there's been a lot of good work to show how you can organise marking, planning, and assessment in ways that push down on those workload burdens. For us, really important, some of those practices don't creep back where they have been addressed, but more is done to get good marking, planning, and assessment practice in place to address workload. And then it's not just workload, but well-being and mental health that's really important as well. DfE has launched, they call it a soft launch, so you can't sign up to this charter yet, but they have soft launched a well-being charter. That might be quite helpful, and that does have some quite interesting and useful advice and guidance for schools and employers on how they can tackle and address teachers' mental health, well-being, good mental health, good well-being in schools. We think that while there are things in that charter that can be improved, there's a lot in it that makes sense, both in terms of what the government can do, what organisations like Ofsted can do, but also what schools can choose to do as well. So that is going to be, again, so members make this very clear, this has to be a real priority for us as your union going into the next academic year. Right, colleagues, I'm gonna stop there. That was a bit of a whistle-stop tour in 45 minutes or so of the big issues that we're facing as a union going into the next academic year, and then some of the things you might want to think about as teachers, either completing your induction or continuing your induction in the next academic year. So what I'm going to do in the 10 minutes we've got left is just have a look at some of the questions that we've had in the Q&A. So we've got a question here from Natasha, and Natasha's had an excellent morning taking her daughter swimming, and you missed the webinar before, so apologies for that, Natasha. And Natasha asked a really good question: what is an NQT +1? Okay, Natasha, an NQT +1 is an NQT this year, continuing next year. So it's someone who was undertaking induction in 2020-21. That teacher in 21-22 is referred to as an NQT +1, and that's all it means. The reason it's important is because those teachers who were completing induction on the those who were completing induction as part of the kind of old arrangements next year, those NQT +1 teachers, their schools will be given money to provide 5% reduction in timetable teaching time. And I kind of went through some of the background to that. So that's effectively what that phrase means. The DfE might not keep using that phrase. The phrases do change very often, sometimes as often as the weather, but that's the current phrase that's being used. But just for shorthand, that's what NQT +1 means. Had a question from Rachel, who asked about those of us who are on the ECF pilot scheme. And good morning, Rachel. That's a really good question. So In summary, for those of you who weren't aware of the ECF pilot, the ECF was piloted in 4 regions of the country during 2020-21. Northeast of England, local authorities in Greater Manchester, Bradford and Doncaster were the formal areas where schools didn't have to, but they could take part in the ECF pilot schemes. The ECF was being piloted. The ECF, Rachel, under the pilot was not something that was statutory, so it was a kind of done on a pilot basis. So those NQTs who were taking part in the ECF, the judgment about induction, whether you complete induction, takes place at the end of 1 year of induction, because there's only 1 year of statutory induction. In the second year, you get access to ECF materials that have been produced, but the induction period is still 1 year. If any problems about that, Rachel, please do get in touch with us, and we will talk you through any of the concerns around that. But in broad terms, that's the issue. Just an anonymous question here, which is around the discussion that was had earlier this morning, is that you can continue your induction under the early career framework. And she talked about transitional schools or something like that. Effectively, what that is saying is you can choose, if you want, you can choose to continue your induction under the ECF. So you can say you have the option to say, actually, I'd like to have access to the ECF materials. That is an option, and it may be worth having a conversation with your head teacher about that. You don't have to do it, but you can do it. But whatever the circumstances, whether you kind of do that formally and say, okay, I'd like to complete my induction using the ECF materials, nothing changes in terms of the point at which the judgment about whether you completed induction is made. So that's still 1 year, because you're still covered by those arrangements. And in all circumstances, whether you kind of do that on a very formal basis or not, schools are encouraged to make use of the early career framework materials to provide some additional support for NQTs in those circumstances. So the extent to which schools can do it is a matter for that school to determine. It would be good to have a conversation about your induction, pointing out the early career framework. But ultimately, what I think is decided will need to be guided by what you think is in your best interest. So if the school, for example, you're working in has got ECTs who'll be doing the ECF, then it might be more straightforward for you to say, well, actually, I'd quite like to access the ECF if I can. If there are no ECTs in your schools, that might be more challenging, but it's still possible to draw upon the framework in supporting you during the rest of your induction. But we'll certainly put some more information on that particular option in the future. We've had a question here from Bazarat. Good morning, Bazarat, who asks, how many hours over a 2-week timetable would incorporate the 5%? So that's just a basic mathematical calculation. If you think about how your 10% reduction in timetable teaching time was calculated this year, you just halve it. But the key point is that doesn't have to be, for some schools it would be difficult to factor that in every week into a timetable. The key point is, and it's pretty straightforward calculation, if you know how much time you got last year, you take that, you halve it, and that's how much time you're entitled to in the second year. But it's important that the overall amount of time over the course of the year equates to that 5% reduction. So that's the first step, is to calculate what you think you're entitled to. The second step is to have that conversation with your school about how that 5% will be facilitated. There are lots of, some of the conversations I've had already with schools. They're just effectively working out how many full days that would account to over the course of a year. It depends upon your different kind of circumstances, how you're working. But you calculate how many days that equates to. So what's 5% over the course of a year in individual days? And then what you can do is say, okay, we've got the money to pay for supply cover for those days. You can have non-contact time those days away from your classroom, pretty much the same way you would if you were off sick. Get a supply teacher in, they will cover your class, and then you have time away from the classroom to work on professional development activities, to do some of the things maybe that you would have done this year that you haven't had the chance to because of the pandemic. Okay. Yes, there's a question here again around completing only one term of induction, and then the point is being made that we all deserve the opportunity to continue induction under the ECF where possible. That's a really good point, and those resources and materials are there. I have to say to you, there are some NQTs who really don't want to have access to the ECF, and that can be their choice and the choice of their school. But you're absolutely right. They are potentially very helpful. They've been designed based upon feedback from previous year's NQTs. So what I would say around that is that in the statutory guidance that's being produced for 2021, this September, it does say that where possible and where appropriate, continuing induction programs should draw upon the ECF. And I think we would say that should absolutely be the case. It should be a discussion between you and your school about how best to do that, and everyone's needs are different and their individual needs. But absolutely, that's a really good point, that if you think that the ECF is going to be really helpful for you, and there's some advice and guidance on our website, as I say, about the ECF, you go and look at the materials, then absolutely you should get that support, because in addition to the 5% that's being provided for next academic year, the ECF provides the kind of support that NQTs in the past, not just during the pandemic, but pre-pandemic, have said really should have been available. So I absolutely agree with that particular point. Just a couple more questions. How much money does the school receive for the NQTs getting their 5% reduction timetable? That's based on a reasonably complex formula, but the main point to take away, so it depends upon the school, it depends upon where the school is in the country, but effectively what you can be confident about is that your school will have enough money to give you that 5% reduction in timetable teaching time. So it isn't necessarily about the amount, because the amount will vary. The school, the DfE will calculate the amount that the school needs, and the school will have that money. So saying that, well, we've got the 5% money from the DfE, but it's not enough to provide you with a 5% reduction, is not good enough. That money is there, and it will be sufficient for every NQT in those circumstances to get 5%, wherever they are in the country, whatever type of school they're working in. And just to make the point, it is just state funded schools, so that isn't something that can be provided in the independent sector, and that's because funding for induction in normal circumstances from the DfE only goes to the state funded sector. So but in state schools, that money is going to be there. That's a really key point. So if you're fobbed off next year by an employer that says, well, we got the money but it wasn't enough, that's when you need to come and speak to us about that, because that will not be the case. I think some of the questions that are coming up here, I think hopefully I've addressed. Just one question here from Emma. Good morning, Emma. And Emma asks, can I start as a 1-year NQT in September 2021 or January 2022? The answer is no, you can't. So if you haven't started your induction yet, if you're starting your induction from the 1st of September 2021, it's the ECF, and it's the ECF with a 2-year induction period. Just to kind of note on the 2-year induction period, without going into the detail of the ECF, normally what you would do and what you have to do under the current arrangements is prorata the induction period. So if you're working part-time, let's say for simplicity, you're working on a half timetable, then your a 0.5 contract, then effectively your induction would be 2 years, because that 2 years would equate to 1 year full-time equivalent. With a 2-year induction, if you're working part-time, that could lead to a very, very long induction period spanning 3, 4, 5 years. So there is scope in the guidance. It's not particularly prescriptive, but there is scope in the guidance to say, look, a 4 or 5 year induction period is quite long. You can reduce that, but that has to be done carefully. And also, everyone should always remember that any agreement you make to shorten your induction period for whatever reason, well, there may be good reasons for doing that, but one of the things you are doing is basically handing over really important rights. So when you curtail your induction period, you're saying, I no longer want a 10% reduction in timetable teaching time. That's why you have to think very carefully about reducing it. But to answer your question, Emma, no, any induction that starts, if you haven't started at your induction yet, starting it on the 1st of September, then that will have to be under the career framework. It's a really good question here about, which we probably don't have time to go into, but a really good question about observation with bubbles closing and how can school mentors help. Observation is a really important part of induction. It's an important part of the mentoring process as well. I think that consideration is being given to how that might take place most effectively during a set of circumstances where some form of restrictions continue to be in place in schools. There are no restrictions, then obviously there isn't an issue there around bubbles, but bubbles remain, and I think that's going to be something that will definitely need to be thought about. Right, I think we've reached, colleagues, 11:30, so I'm going to stop now and give you a chance to get a drink and stretch your legs. I hope that's been of help to you. Please do look out for more advice and guidance on our website about all of these issues, but we'll certainly make sure that there's something up there very shortly, certainly before at the start of next term, around the 5% reduction in timetable teaching time, NQT +1s, if we're still using that term by the time we get to September, but hopefully you will know what I mean by that now. And also some support for you in terms of what you might do if that time isn't being made available. One takeaway is schools have that money. So if they've got the money, they've got enough time, they've got enough resource to give you that reduction. And if they've got the money, you've got to use it for that purpose. Come and see us also if your school hands the money back. Really shouldn't be doing that. You should be using the resource to support you, to give you the chance to address some of the really significant disruption that you've experienced during your induction. I'm going to stop there, colleagues. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for your time this morning. We always appreciate you're extremely busy, but hopefully that was of some help and value to you. And I'll leave it there. Take care. And I very much hope to see you soon. Thank you.